There was a school shooting in Brazil the other day, and the media is now trying to use international tragedy as an excuse to talk once again about American gun control policies. Of course, none of their ideas will work, and they won't even acknowledge the real cause of these problems and these shootings, but we'll go over all that, so do stay tuned.
John Doyle in Heck Off, Commie.
Hey guys, welcome to Heck Off, Commie. My energy is usually pretty high, but this topic is just dark and I've taken kind of a black pill, to be honest, so just bear with me. Also, make sure you have notifications turned on so that YouTube doesn't decide to separate us, but let's start by going over what happened. Two young men who will remain nameless and faceless on this channel, at least, for reasons that we'll go over shortly. They entered into their school in Suzano, Brazil on Wednesday during the lunch break and shot an education coordinator and a supervisor and then proceeded to open fire on students in the schoolyard. There were a total of 7 people killed and more than 10 injured, and both of the attackers killed themselves at the school. The reason that this story is being passed around the American media is because the president of Brazil signed a decree in January that loosened the regulations on obtaining and owning a firearm, and the left is saying that this is the cause of the school shootings, which of course it is not. Brazil has one of the highest murder rates in the world. There's something like 64,000 murders in just 2017, and about 43,000 of those were caused by firearms. The decree that the president signed just makes it easier for citizens to keep guns in their homes. It waives the requirement for an interview with a federal police officer, during which you must explain why you have the need for a gun in your home. And it increases the validity of a gun license from 5 to 10 years. To obtain a firearm in Brazil, you have to be at least 25, you have to register it, you can't carry it outside your residence unless you have a special permit that only are typically given to special groups such as law enforcement, and you also have to pay to have it registered, you have to pay to get the license, pay to get it renewed, so already it's a lot more tedious than in most parts of America, yet they're still experiencing murders. And now a school shooting that the American media is using to say, hey, Brazil loosened gun laws, which is already an overstatement if we're being frank, and then a school shooting happened, and I assume that this relationship is inherently causal because I never took a statistics class and it's more convenient to my narrative and my agenda. It's probably the latter though. Regardless, a school shooting still happened. They still happen in America every year, and we can make the same tired case about guns and gun control and just repeat NRA talking points. But like I said, that's not going to solve the problem. Don't get me wrong. I love Ted Nugent. I love the NRA, but actually, I'm kind of mad at them. But the case I'm trying to make, if you make the case for guns, that's only going to argue against people trying to take guns away. We have to redirect the conversation to stopping the mass shootings from happening in the first place. It'd be significantly harder for the leftist media to dogmatize people into supporting gun regulations if that happened. And you might say, well, John, arming good guys does stop mass shootings because a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with... Correct. Yes, I know. I've heard that. We agree. But there are 3 levels of problem solving that I'm seeing right now. The core of the problem is that someone decided that they are to walk into a school or a public domain and start gunning down innocent people. That's the problem. We can arm more good guys, and then since we haven't solved the underlying problem, we're just going to have mass shooters being able to kill a few less innocent civilians before your Uncle Randy takes them out with his 1911 that he insists is not outdated. Or you can make it harder to obtain guns, and now you've got mass shooters killing more people because they are now more likely to be unarmed, or perhaps they go into a gun-free zone where every law-abiding citizen must be unarmed. And then people die, and even if you removed all guns, which you will never be able to do, the underlying problem is that someone entered into a state of mind that was dark enough to compel them to want to kill innocent people. The Columbine shooters, they were going to blow up their school with propane bombs. Timothy McVeigh, he used explosives, he killed 168 people. If someone wants to hurt other people, I promise you that you will not be able to stop them. You might make it a little less convenient for them, and in the process, you might also make it significantly more difficult for innocent people to defend themselves, but they will do it because by the time they have reached that point mentally, they do not care anymore. Their entire reason for being at that point has devolved into the destruction of their fellow man. To be fair, some people have tried to redirect this issue to what it is, which is a mental health issue, but they've been met with backlash for stigmatizing mental health, which is ridiculous because to suggest that a mass shooter is not mentally ill is probably the most ignorant statement that you could possibly make pertaining to the matter. But the conversation is quickly directed by the most despicable and abhorrent people in the media, and I mean that literally. They note that most of these shootings are being perpetuated by white men, and that they make the case that the reason that white men are committing these atrocities is because they're fragile male egos and their white male entitlement. Not only is this incorrect, it is a malicious thing to say. To suggest that mass shootings are a symptom of being male or of being white is just an evil thing to say, especially because, and we'll explain why, it completely ignores the problems that are disproportionately affecting white men, that perhaps could explain why white men are disproportionately committing these atrocities. And if there was anything that proves that white men are the most hated demographic by the media, it is that. If you are a white man and you are watching, understand that they hate you. They view you as having privilege because of your gender, because of your skin tone, and then when you become consumed by darkness and decide to kill yourself or kill other people, they don't reconsider the hypothesis and think, maybe they weren't as well off as we thought. They just say that, well, that's what happens when you're an entitled white man with a fragile ego, and you can dismiss it as just, oh, some people are evil. That's lazy thinking. People aren't inherently good or evil, but both are very possible. And ironically, it's the same bullshit leftist narrative of undermining the role of fathers and shaming masculinity that is breeding these mass shooters. If you want to stop mass shootings from happening, stop doing that. And I'm going to read an excerpt from the speech that I delivered at the University of Michigan that's relevant to this topic. I didn't even have it pulled up. I'm sorry. 1 in 3 children live without their father. That discriminates against young men more so than young women. Studies have shown that father absence leads to more mental health and behavioral problems in boys than in girls. According to 2 MIT economists, growing up in a single-parent home appears to significantly decrease the probability of college attendance for boys, but has no similar effect on girls. Remember how we talked about women outnumbering men on college campuses. Fatherless boys are also less ambitious, less hopeful, and more likely to get into trouble at school than fatherless girls. For boys, being raised without a father decreases their likelihood of being employed by 8 to 10 points. So what do they do when they grow up? That's the thing. They don't grow up. Roughly 22% of men between the ages of 22 and 54 are doing no paid work at all. They aren't technically unemployed because they've already left the labor force. They gave up. Who's going to want to marry them if they can't acquire any resources? When girls grow up without a father, they learn that maybe a long-term mating strategy isn't such a good idea since it was unsuccessful for their mother. So they start to have lots of short-term partners with a very high turnover rate. And there's even evidence that displays young women who grow up without a father start puberty earlier than girls that grow up with a father, likely because they're trying to expedite the process of short-term mating. Married men with high school diplomas are more likely to be employed than single men with some college or even an associate's degree. So what do? A lot of them turn to opiates, which is a whole other discussion that we won't get into now, but you would better believe that it's related. They also spend 5.5 hours a day watching TV on average. Meanwhile, their female peers who were not as affected by not having a father are now earning the majority of bachelors, masters, and PhDs in America. And we already talked about women being less likely to want to marry someone less educated than they are, so now the balance has completely shifted. As Nobel Prize-winning economist George Akerlof has said, men settle down when they get married. If they never get married, they never settle down. Marriage seems to motivate men to work harder, likely an evolutionary adaptation because if they don't continue to provide for their spouse, you will find a mate of higher value that can. Married men work about 400 hours more per year than their single peers with equivalent backgrounds. A Harvard study shows that married men earn between 10 and 40% more than their single peers with similar education and skills, and that this was observed not only in the United States, but in the UK and Sweden as well. When men don't grow up with their fathers, they lose their sense of identity that can turn some of them into very dark places. As of February 2018, 26 of the 27 deadliest mass shooters did not grow up with their biological father. Between 1980 and 2008, black Americans committed 52% of the murder despite being 13% of the population. The single motherhood rate in the black community is 72%. You tell me when we can start correlating. Growing up without your biological father is the single greatest predictor of whether or not a young man ends up in prison. But feminists have underplayed the role of fathers. They've tried to shame men for their toxic masculinity. What they seem not to understand to such an extreme that it's almost a form of miracle is that it isn't that the masculinity is toxic, it's that the masculinity isn't there. No one is there to teach them how to be a man, so they become violent. Toxic masculinity is what happens to young men that don't have guidance. Masculinity is competence. Masculinity is bravery. Masculinity is 4 young men shielding their girlfriends as someone shoots up a movie theater, resulting in 3 of them dying, but all of the women surviving. Masculinity is Todd Beamer telling Mark Bingham, Tom Burnett, and Jeremy Glick that they're going to have to jump on the hijackers and crash the plane into the ground so that the terrorists couldn't fulfill their plans. Masculinity is manning up, which the feminists say now is a toxic phrase, but manning up just means face your problems, face your leviathans, slay your dragons. For Todd Beamer, man up was let's roll, and that's the last thing that was overheard before the plane crashed and everyone on board was killed because Todd Beamer and the other passengers manned up. My reading voice is bad, I apologize, but I can speak somewhat from experience with this. Obviously, I'm not a mass shooter. I never intended to be a mass shooter, but my parents divorced when I was 8 years old, and the relationship that I had with my dad was very awkward until I was about 16, I would say, and that's not his fault. It's really not. It's just the reality of the situation was that he didn't live with us anymore. He still came to all of my events and birthday parties and stuff like that, but it was just really difficult not having that masculine presence in the house anymore. And I didn't realize this at the time, but as I've gotten older and I've thought about it more and I've been able to connect some lines, Like young men, we derive our entire sense of masculinity and meaning as what it means to be a man is all derived from our dads. And when you don't have that, you get really confused. And I was in this really dark place before I started to get everything together. And I remember I was reading books and researching about like mass shooters. I read the diaries that the Columbine kids left, and I never wanted to hurt anybody. I never wanted to do anything like that. Let me stress that. No one was ever going to get hurt, but I just remember being able to understand the state of mind. They were so angry with life and with existence. They just wanted to lash out and have one final you before they died. And I remember like resonating with that because my home environment was not stable. I was depressed. I was getting bullied at school. It was really fucking rough. And I truly don't know the process by which I was able to get out of that mindset, but there are a lot of young men that can't get out of that mindset. There are a lot of young men in general that can't, or excuse me, men in general that can't get out of that mindset. And then it will metastasize into something truly terrible. That got really deep. I apologize, but point is, men need fathers. Men are being feminized by women. It's not helping anybody at all. We don't need less masculinity. We need more masculinity, because without it, young men become displaced and angry with existence. They hate the totem pole so much because they've been shoved to the bottom of it by society. So they just decide, you know what? I'm just going to burn the whole totem pole down. I'm just going to destroy it all. Why do you think these things happen at school or at the workplace? It's symbolic. It's a symbolic gesture of the system that these people have grown to hate. That's why people that occupy these spaces that didn't even directly impact the lives of the perpetrator find themselves staring down the barrel of a gun. It isn't always about the people. It's about the entire system that they regard as the reason for their suffering. It's about total revenge on the idea of existence. And of course, these ideas don't describe every single case of every person ever doing something violent ever, but we can't just ignore the facts of what's playing a significant role in the cause of these incidents. Young men grow up in homes full of women, then they go to school where they are taught by women and treated like defective girls. Girls are the standard of behavior that boys are to be held to. Natural male aggression and restlessness is treated as disruption. And then, wait a second, Mrs. Robinson, or Miss Robinson, because she's a badass single mom, Tommy here needs to go see a specialist. Fast forward, now Tommy's on Adderall, Prozac, Ritalin. Who even knows? The Citizens Commission on Human Rights' international investigation into school violence reveals that at least 36 school shootings and or school-related acts of violence have been committed by those taking or withdrawing from psychiatric drugs, resulting in 172 wounded and 80 killed. However, in other school shootings, information about their drug use was never made public, so it doesn't really confirm or refute if they were under the influence of prescribed drugs or had undergone other sorts of behavioral therapy. CCHR says that training teachers and others in detecting and predicting violent behavior won't stop the problem, because there's no definitive science on how to actually go about this, even according to psychiatrists and psychologists. According to Stephen D. Hart, a psychologist at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, quote, "There is no instrument that is specifically useful or validated for identifying potential school shooters or mass murderers. An APA task force report admitted that psychiatric expertise in the prediction of dangerousness is not established. CCHR says that although there can be numerous reasons for mass murder, violent crime, and suicide, the prevalence of psychotropic drug use in the pediatric and adolescent population is a potential catalyst for violence in the percentage that is actually taking them." Dr. David Kirshner, a New York psychologist, explained, quote, "As a forensic psychologist, I have tested/evaluated 30 teenagers and young adult murderers, and almost all of them had been in some kind of treatment, usually short-term and psychoactive drug-oriented, before they killed. After each episode of school killings or other mass shootings, such as the Aurora, Colorado Batman movie murders and Tucson, Arizona killing of 6 and wounding of Gabrielle Giffords and 12 others, there's a renewed public outcry for early identification and treatment of youths at risk for violence. Sadly, however, most of the young people who kill had been in treatment prior to the violence, albeit with less than successful results." A review of scientific literature published in Ethical Human Psychology and Psychiatry regarding the astonishing rate of mental illness over the last 50 years revealed that it's not mental illness that's causing the problem, but rather the psychiatric drugs prescribed to treat the problem. Since the introduction of antipsychotics in 1955 and the newer selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antidepressants like Prozac in 1987, both are documented to be linked to violent effects. In the 1970s, 150,000 American children were taking stimulants for ADHD. By 2014, it's reached 4.3 million, a 2,700% increase. The proportion of U.S. children and teens taking antidepressants between 2005 and 2012 increased from 1.3 to 1.6%, despite the FDA black box warning in 2004 that antidepressants may induce suicidal behavior. Between 2002 and 2009, pediatric prescriptions for atypical antipsychotics increased by 65%, from 2.9 to about 4.8 million. A staggering 90% of those prescriptions are off-label according to a 2012 study published in JAMA Psychiatry, with ADHD and disruptive behavior accounting for about 38% of all antipsychotic use in children and teens. Almost 20,000 prescriptions for these antipsychotic drugs were written in 2014 for children 2 and younger, a 50% jump from 13,000 just 1 year before. According to the prescription data company IMS Health, prescriptions for the antidepressant fluoxetine, that's mispronounced, but it's a generic of Prozac, rose 23% in 1 year for that age group to about 83,000. Researchers took the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System data and identified 31 drugs disproportionately associated with violence. These drugs, accounting for 79% of all violent cases reported, included 25 psychotropic drugs. Their findings, published in Public Liberty of Science 1, included 11 antidepressants, 6 hypnotics, 3 drugs for the treatment of ADHD. Symptoms include disturbed mood, persistent insomnia, emotional lability, irritability, depression, impaired concentration and memory, and poor stress tolerance, according to a study published in Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics in 2012. A British psychiatrist and others reported in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs, quote, "It is now accepted that all major classes of psychiatric medication produce distinctive withdrawal effects, which mostly reflect their pharmacological activity. And, just like the various substances that are used recreationally, each type of psychiatric medication induces a distinctive altered mental and physical state. Withdrawal from psychiatric drugs, including antidepressants and antipsychotics, is associated with distinctive withdrawal or discontinuation syndromes, which are suppressed and are significant, quote, because they may be and probably are mistaken for signs of relapse, according to their research." Dr. Kirshner adds that, quote, "Most of the young murderers I have personally examined had been in treatment and were using prescribed stimulant, amphetamine-type drugs before and during the killing events. These medications did not prevent, but instead contributed to the violence." Given this, it is insane that the small branch, the twig of the mass shooting discussion that's directed towards mental health complains that, well, it's because of the lack of funding. If only we had more funding, we could fix this. Wrong. Incorrect. You lose. Good day, sir. The funding isn't the problem. The problem is that the system that you are trying to fund is corrupt and is helping to create the problem, not solve it. The pharmaceutical companies largely dictate what's taught in medical schools, even down to the textbooks. They're being educated to push drugs on patients like industry whores. They target young med students and seduce them with educational grants. Thousands of U.S. doctors are on the payroll of Big Pharma. Since 1990, they've spent at least $150 million buying politicians. They spend more annually advertising than any other industry in the country. And now, if you talk to any doctor, they'll tell you, yeah, now I have patients coming in, they're telling me to write them prescriptions for drugs that they saw on TV. In 2012 alone, they spent $3.5 billion marketing their drugs on TV, radio, magazines, internet, everything. It's always the same message that they're conveying. It's always, oh, look at how happy look, they're running outside with a dog. That could be you. Just ignore all the side effects that we're quickly listing while you're distracted by the dog. That's who's to blame. This whole system is literally set up through the media, through the cultural narrative, through the educational system, through the bureaucracy, through the pharmaceutical industry, to set up young men to grow up in a house with no father, thank you second wave feminism, to go to school where they're even further feminized and then made to feel ashamed of their masculinity, thanks to the media and to the educational system for that one. And then they're forced to take drugs that turn them into zombies that start to rationalize why it might just be okay to go violently lash out at their own existence, thanks to the pharmaceutical companies. And thank you to the bureaucracy for that one. And then sometimes if they don't just, commit suicide right off the bat, they'll go do something awful and the media will say, aha, this is what happens when fragile male egos and toxic masculinity and all of that comes together. It keeps the wheels turning. It just keeps it turning, you idiots. No, they're not idiots. That's the thing. We assume they're idiots because we want to assume good intentions out of a misguided sense of optimism. It's not that they're incompetent. If they only knew better, they wouldn't do this. They know exactly what the they're doing. They just don't care because they're getting paid. They profit off of every school shooting. The leftist media jump on that because it fuels their narrative of masculinity is bad and so are guns, so let's just remove them both. Make men more feminine and fund mental health programs that continue to prescribe men these drugs that have been proven to make them more violent. Big Pharma says, that sounds like a good idea to me. And then, another school shooting happened, and it just repeats and it repeats until we're all dead and nothing matters. And this isn't one of those Big Pharma conspiracy theories. All of this is publicly available information. Go back, look up everything I put up on the screen with a little blip if you don't believe me. It's all cited, and if you really want to stop these mass shootings, if you really want to help the country, you have to abandon the feminist narrative. You have to. It was the feminist narrative and the sexual revolution that undermined the role of the father and encouraged women to break free from the prison of marriage. And now, The leftist moral relativism tell you that you're judgmental because you disapprove of single motherhood. Don't hate on badass single moms despite mountains and mountains of peer-reviewed data saying that, oh yeah, the best situation for a child to grow up in is actually with a mother and a father across all races, all ethnicities, incomes, levels of education, everything. So given this information, the fact that people in the media and the people lobbying on behalf of Big Pharma and the doctors that sell themselves out to it, given this, it can either be one of two things. Okay. One, they're either so grossly incompetent and ill-informed that we as a society should really begin to question why the hell we even put them in those perceivably important positions that they're occupying in the first place. Or they possess a level of malevolence and greed that has transcended at least my comprehension. You gotta pick one.